At 9:30 in the evening in Minneapolis, a high-ranking U.S. Army officer was uncovered during an abrupt strike involving massive amounts of narcotics and Army-grade armaments. If you wish to uncover the reality of this mission, please press the like button so this reaches a wider audience. The city streets were quiet as 5 unmarked vehicles came to a halt in front of a dim storage facility with their motors humming softly. Over 50 operatives from the FBI and ICE took their places with intensity and sharp focus. Without any prior alert, a heavy iron ram crashed through the side entrance, warping the metal as officers poured into the structure. A violent gun battle rattled the facility for more than 10 minutes. Once the shooting ceased, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of fumes, chemical substances, and terror. Sprawled across the ground was a massive stockpile of illegal drugs, including 2 tons of cocaine and 6 tons of fentanyl and heroin, which could kill a whole metropolis repeatedly. Next to the narcotics sat military-class guns and protective gear, while piles of currency lined the perimeter totaling hundreds of millions. However, the most frightening find was neither the cash nor the illegal substances. Resting on a steel desk were top-secret files containing lists, charts, and autographs with one specific name at the head: General Abdul Omar of the U.S. Army. This was far from ordinary street thuggery. It was a covert enterprise run from within the establishment, and this was merely the start. If you are interested in who constructed this kingdom from within, please comment the word expose and click like as we start to purge the corruption from the government. General Abdul Omar, aged 56, did not start his life as a lawbreaker. He arrived in America as a young boy, enlisted in the U.S. Army at 18, and took an oath to protect the country. He gained admiration in the infantry, followed by logistics and intelligence roles where superiors relied on his self-control and tactical skills. He climbed the hierarchy rapidly and was granted entry to classified information, military installations, and supply lines. Most people assumed he would conclude his service with dignity, but eventually his drive transformed into something more sinister. Omar realized that true authority within the armed forces was not about firepower but about accessibility. He managed freight paths, delivery timetables, and shipping crates passing through key harbors. Silently, he started to redirect them so aircraft that formerly hauled gear now carried locked bins with fake documentation. Vehicles bearing military markings passed through security stops without ever being searched. Concealed behind those locks, tons of drugs traversed the nation. Omar broadened his scope by forming partnerships with the Sinaloa cartel CJNG and militant factions in the Middle East. He established a web that extended across international boundaries to safeguard his operations. He constructed an impeccable monetary disguise where millions were laundered via investment companies, local banks, and charitable organizations. The documentation looked authentic even though the funds were illicit. The entire scheme was engineered to conceal reality right in front of everyone. As his power expanded, he shifted from controlling supply lines to controlling individuals. Military personnel, bureaucrats, and magistrates were paid off, coerced, or convinced they were acting for the good of the nation. Individually, they ceased asking questions and the chain of command went quiet. When dangers arose, Omar did not back down but instead permitted brutality. Shootouts broke out in locations that were previously thought to be secure. Combat equipment, protective vests, and military standard arms began showing up in criminal investigations. Law enforcement was shocked because these were not ordinary street offenses. They were coordinated missions executed with hardware designed for warfare. The individual relied upon to protect America had utilized the infrastructure to construct a concealed kingdom. The treachery was not just personal, it was systemic, and the repercussions were only starting. If you desire the reality regarding Omar's covert web, comment show me so this narrative spreads to more individuals. The finding at the warehouse was merely the start, as documents, charts, and financial logs all indicated a single site. It was an industrial district on the outskirts of Minneapolis that appeared deserted, with corroded fences, quiet hangars, and shattered lamps. However, satellite photos revealed activity such as lorries arriving after dark, thermal readings radiating from within, and armed sentries walking the boundary. This was no simple storage depot, it was a stronghold. Federal leaders assembled in a protected tactical room where charts filled the walls and drones transmitted real-time video. Red lines outlined the paths of arms and deliveries linked explicitly to General Omar. Each access point had been designed to withstand an attack, featuring watchtowers, reinforced trucks, and concealed shooting spots hidden by vacant structures. The proof was undeniable, and a dossier was sent to the White House. It detailed the confiscated drugs, retrieved armaments, compromised bureaucrats, and diagrams of the compound. The president reviewed it, deliberately going through it sheet by sheet. When he was done, he rose, and his tone was piercing enough to slice through the quiet. A general of the United States has constructed an illicit stronghold on our own territory. This is a matter of national safety, and I demand every bureau, every resource, and every tool we possess. We are going to destroy it this very evening. Commands radiated across the nation within moments. For the first time in recent history, the FBI, the Army, and over 100 federal departments organized a combined strike. Transport columns departed from assembly points while choppers took off from airfields. Night vision devices were locked into position as troops inspected their firearms and communication gear. The mood was not one of thrill but of resolve blended with a silent fury. It was the sensation of having been deceived by a member of their own ranks. At precisely 2:03 in the morning the attack commenced. Darkened choppers soared just above the pastures with their rotors cutting through the frigid atmosphere. Reconnaissance drones lit up the boundary from overhead, highlighting sentry spots with luminous borders. The tanks roared toward the entrances, and when they impacted the initial barrier the ground trembled. Sparks flew as the metal warped and then gave way. What followed was rapid, brutal and conclusive. Operatives advanced in surges with shields raised and rifles stable while blasting charges blew open the side entrances. Stun grenades transformed the darkness into blinding white brightness. Inside the facility was a labyrinth of lab supply chambers and fortified shelters where the scent of chemicals lingered heavily. The meticulous preparation was evident as every wall was dense, every hallway tight, and every corner engineered to delay intruders. However, accuracy triumphed over architecture as squads moved forward with control, clearing room after room and hall after hall. Shots rang out as armed defenders fought back from behind piled boxes and reinforced sheets. The conflict was short but intense. When the firing ceased, men lay prone with their wrists bound and guns strewn across the cement. Then the real surprise arrived behind a steel gate that was locked 3 times over. There stood a manufacturing assembly with stainless vats, moving belts, and shelves of chemical barrels. It was a complete drug production plant guarded by military protection. Close by, boxes of bullets were piled beside reinforced sheets, helmets, and combat equipment. A secondary operations hub was found featuring monitors, charts, and secure radios. On the wall hung a weathered picture of General Omar in his dress blues with ribbons on his chest, shaking hands with high commanders. It was the grinning visage of a man who had once taken an oath to protect the nation. Now everything was revealed and the stronghold had been taken. In the gloom of that deserted manufacturing sector, agents realized the significance. The triumph of the night was genuine, but the conflict was nowhere near finished. The stronghold is destroyed, but the battle is not done, so if you are prepared for what detectives discovered next, comment ready and continue viewing. The stronghold had collapsed, but its demolition did not conclude the investigation. Indeed, the mission provoked even greater inquiries. What Omar had constructed was not a solitary rogue unit but a web threaded into the gears of the state. It was a framework that extended well past a lone facility on the outskirts of Minneapolis. When detectives examined the proof retrieved from the location, they were surprised by how mundane the files appeared. There were agreements, supply requisitions, fuel commands, and repair bills where nothing about them implied a threat. However, every sheet was linked to Omar's business. His brilliance was straightforward and frightening because he hid illegal acts within routine documentation. The red flags that ought to have alerted inspectors were concealed under administrative jargon and formal seals. The further the detectives probed, the more distinct the design became. Omar never operated by himself. There were autographs from colonels and private suppliers, emails containing warm salutations, and memos written on the edges saying approved without weight or managed silently. These were not penned by mobsters or traffickers. They were authored by individuals within the establishment who thought they were performing their duties, or by those persuaded to stop asking questions. Some had taken packets of money while others were assured advancement, and a handful were frightened into keeping quiet. In gatherings where rumors moved quicker than facts, a single sentence was repeated constantly. Just authorize it because the general ordered it. Federal detectives questioned scores of military personnel, administrators, and bureaucrats. Many found it hard to justify how they had overlooked glaring indicators. One individual spoke softly without raising his gaze, saying, "You do not challenge a distinguished commander, you simply salute and proceed." That was the snare, as Omar had turned his good name into a weapon. Simultaneously, the brutality beyond the documents intensified. Dispatches came in from California, Texas, Virginia, and Minnesota describing gunfights in manufacturing zones, storage depots, and even close to Army logistics centers. Surveillance footage revealed reinforced cars lacking registration tags. Rifles meant for overseas war zones were showing up at local crime sites. Forensic squads traced serial codes back to inventories under Omar's authority. Each account felt like evidence of treason. These were not neighborhood gangs creating random disorder. They were individuals drilled in strategy formations and armaments designed for combat. The surprise radiated through the police community as local chiefs insisted on explanations and sheriffs convened urgent gatherings. A seasoned officer stood at a microphone during a media update and stated that this is not narcotics in a cellar but organized warfare. Someone is orchestrating it from the shadows. Agents examined years of supervision logs and a trend appeared involving strange deliveries, gear that disappeared, and fuel that surpassed operational requirements. Each specific was minor by itself, but combined they created a picture of graft. Even magistrates were pulled into the net as files showed rulings that dropped accusations against men later found to be Omar's runners. Funds were tracked to political contributions and judicial mandates restricted inspections citing national safety reasons. It was evident that sway had expanded silently and profoundly through levels of power. There was no solitary instant of failure. Instead, it resembled watching a drape drop in slow motion to show a set that had always existed. What the stronghold revealed was merely the entrance. Behind it was a web that had dissolved into American society using uniform shields, offices and ranks as protection. In command centers throughout the nation, a singular realization took hold. Omar's kingdom had not vanished with the strike, it had merely been uncovered. Being uncovered signaled the start of a much bigger struggle. It was one that would extend into corporate offices, military posts and tribunals before it concluded. If the fortress exposed Omar's armaments, the account books exposed his influence. Following the strike, forensic bookkeepers, federal inspectors and digital squads assembled in a protected building in Minneapolis. On the desks lay piles of files seized from depots, offices and concealed vaults. At first look they appeared dull, featuring bills, delivery mandates and advisory charges where none seemed illegal. Yet each sheet bore a quiet signal that cash was flowing and nobody knew its destination. The group labored day and night while banking logs were charted across a massive display. Crimson lines linked accounts in Minneapolis, Chicago, Dallas and Dubai. Each path signified a movement of money, frequently in huge sums. What startled the detectives was not that Omar possessed wealth, but how legitimate it appeared. There were no mounds of currency or clandestine bags. Instead, the funds moved through organizations that were deemed reliable, such as financial advisory groups, shipping firms, defense suppliers, and non-profits. Each of these entities submitted tax returns, paid staff, and funded local activities. They were a component of the American scenery. Yet behind the lawful documentation they siphoned millions of dollars from drug and gun trades. One researcher reviewed a transaction and murmured that this is not street illegality, this is corporate business. Whenever a cargo traveled, funds moved through various strata, including a charge from a foreign harbor, a service invoice from a defense supplier, or an advisory cost from a charity. The ultimate endpoint was a personal ledger, frequently under a fake alias and often linked to a dummy corporation. Detectives pursued the path across continents. Finally, they arrived at a troubling epiphany. Some of the capital came from U.S. military agreements. That finding altered the mood in the chamber. It was no longer an issue of narcotics or firearms, but a matter of national honor. Funds intended for defense repairs and gear had been siphoned off. Omar had transformed lawful dealings into energy for his illegal kingdom. Every buck laundered made his web more robust. As agents tracked the financial path, they discovered something additional, which was influence. Magistrates who threw out lawsuits had obtained charitable gifts. Bureaucrats who authorized deliveries had their home loans settled. A pensioned colonel got monthly advisory payments he could not justify. Initially the trend appeared to be chance, but the papers in the stronghold proved the reality. Omar had constructed a structure of allegiance. Some were eager, others were scared, and a handful thought they were aiding national safety, but everyone took part. The boundaries between correct and incorrect smeared until nobody could distinguish them. Then brutality started to pursue the cash. Wherever capital was gathered, fighting broke out. A depot blaze in New Jersey, a gunfight in Houston, and an armed transport halted on a freeway in Nevada all occurred. Each incident included people linked to Omar's wealth. Police logs were baffled and observers provided brief replies. One sheriff from Arizona remarked that these guys are not narcotics traffickers, they are troops. Public trust started to disintegrate as citizens desired explanations. Media briefings were packed with fury and households demanded to understand how arms intended for combat landed in their communities. Legislators inquired why alert signals had been overlooked for ages. Within federal leadership, one deduction became weightier with every elapsed hour. Omar's kingdom was not founded on concealment, it was founded on faith. He had utilized his attire, his ribbons and his standing to shuttle cash through lenders' agreements and panels. The treason was not noisy, it was silent, administrative, courteous and far more perilous. The financial path did not stop at one individual, it directed to numerous entrances. As each gate unlocked, the detectives grasped a scary reality. The infrastructure had assisted in constructing the empire without ever knowing it. Now that the illumination was active, nobody knew how profound the gloom really went. When the mission concluded and federal teams pulled back from the stronghold, the magnitude of the emergency finally became apparent. What was left amidst the shattered walls was not just the aftermath of a fight, but proof of a system that had been warped internally. The items retrieved narrated a much bigger tale than any depot could hold. They exposed a plan, a framework and an influence that had extended far past the structure itself. The downfall of Omar's web did not commence with detonations or detentions, it commenced with data. Dossiers from various states, financial logs from several nations, and autographs from numerous bureaus all met at a solitary deduction. A person with power had utilized the apparatus of the state to construct an illicit business. The revelation was stunning because it did not look like standard graft. It was structured, deliberate, and engineered to endure. Public response was instant as neighborhoods felt deceived. Civilians who relied on the armed forces as an emblem of safety now faced the truth that a portion of that strength had been abused. It was not merely the narcotics or arms that generated dread, but the awareness that the infrastructure had been leveraged in quietness. Faith once harmed could not be swiftly repaired. Government bodies acted rapidly in reaction. Panels were established to examine acquisition steps, supply routes, and agreement approvals. Inspectors discovered anomalies that had passed unobserved because they were dispersed among various divisions. What appeared to be standard documentation when gathered displayed the framework of a concealed kingdom. Trends appeared showing matching clearances, recurring supplier titles, and gear that never arrived at its planned locations. The repercussions soon reached into judicial proceedings. Federal writs were released throughout several states. People linked to shipping, contracting, and banking sectors were interrogated. Some confessed they had obeyed orders without scrutinizing them. Others rejected blame depending on the intricacy of administration as a defense. Yet records supplied a history that could not be disregarded. Dealings, endorsements, and deliveries created a chain that indicated organization rather than chance. The broader ramifications were deep. The existence of military-class arms in criminal events sparked worries about how gear had been siphoned. The distribution of drugs across far-flung areas pointed to methodical logistics instead of random trafficking. Local officials realized that what they had encountered in their zones was a component of a bigger image, one they had been ignorant of. The disintegration of the mission generated demand for change. Supervision was fortified, audits were multiplied, and fresh tiers of confirmation were implemented. While these steps were essential, they could not wipe away the reality that the weakness had been present for ages. The incidents in Minneapolis were not a solitary occurrence but an illustration of how clout and power, when mixed with concealment, could undermine whole structures. The result of the strikes delivered comfort yet also an enduring warning. An illicit web had been taken apart, but the way it was constructed revealed a more profound danger. Menaces did not always originate from beyond frontiers. Sometimes they grew silently inside bodies that people relied upon. The stronghold acted as an emblem of that truth, a tangible building standing for a concealed design of dominance. The instruction gained was not merely about lawbreaking but about alertness. Structures of influence need openness, and power must be examined as closely as perils from overseas. The collapse of the stronghold ended a section, but it unlocked a query that stayed unanswered. How many additional frameworks might be present in locations nobody has considered checking? The fall of the stronghold did not finish the task, it merely unfolded the chart. When researchers arranged every named car depot and wire transfer, a fresh trend emerged. The kingdom Omar had constructed was not focused in a single structure but was dispersed throughout the state like fragments of a concealed riddle. There were supply centers in tiny manufacturing zones, secure homes in silent neighborhoods, and rental lockers beside country roads. Each one of them held a segment of the web. Within hours, federal leadership released a new directive to hit every site before dawn. Squads gathered from Minneapolis, Rochester, St. Cloud, and Duluth. Columns traveled through the dark on lonely streets while agents held binders with locations, pictures, and threat assessments. The goal was straightforward: to go quickly, strike forcefully, and leave nothing remaining. The assaults commenced shortly past 3 in the morning. In a production lot outside, savage agents entered a metal depot where boxes of compounds were piled from the ground to the roof. In a silent district near Maple Grove, a 2-level house concealed a cellar packed with secure radios and fake IDs. In Rochester, a rental locker contained barrels of drugs encased in thermal plastic prepared for delivery. Every site narrated the identical tale, that this was structured, intentional, and hazardous. Shots broke out in various spots. In a deserted plant near Shakopee, 6 gunmen hid behind equipment, shooting at officers as loaders and skids became barriers. Following a short gun battle, stun grenades swept the area and the targets fell with wrists bound and rifles strewn about. On a freeway outside Mankato, a cargo van attempted to flee. Choppers followed its path while state troopers obstructed the street. The operator gave up when reinforced trucks sealed both sides and high-intensity lamps turned darkness into daylight. By dawn, the roster of objectives had been whittled down to struck through marks on a whiteboard. The outcomes were immense, with scores of targets detained, mounds of drugs taken, and signal centers disabled. Arms, cars, and money were retrieved, but the statistics were merely a fraction of the narrative. What startled detectives the most was the synchronization. Every site possessed the identical layout, with racks tidily marked, cameras aimed at doors, and modems linked to distant hosts. It did not resemble disorder, it resembled engineering. As the sun came up over Minnesota, agents went back to their bases coated in dirt and fatigue. They realized the strikes had delivered a massive impact, yet the atmosphere was not one of rejoicing but of wariness. Because even though the entrances were smashed and even though the firearms were quiet, every detective sensed the same silent query in the chamber. How many additional fragments of this kingdom were still lurking in the shadows? When the sun climbed over Minnesota, the fumes dissipated and the shooting ceased, but the inquiries lingered. The assaults had destroyed depots, secure homes, transports, and even a stronghold constructed by a distinguished commander. The detentions were genuine, the confiscations were huge, and the peril had been faced. Yet the real instruction of this affair was not tallied in the mass of drugs or the quantity of guns. It was gauged in faith. For ages a web had expanded in quietness, concealed under uniforms, documentation, and recognizable visages. It demonstrated that the biggest danger is not always beyond a frontier, but sometimes within an infrastructure that nobody thinks to challenge. Authority can be abused silently, allegiance can be bartered, and institutions must stay alert even regarding their own. But there was merit in the struggle. Federal bureaus labored together, neighborhoods were safeguarded, and the system, although rattled, proved it could still endure, still react, and still protect. The future